There's a massive global housing crisis right now, and Canadians in particular are in a really tough spot both economically and geographically, which on the surface is really weird because Canada's geography is the second largest country in the entire world aside from Russia's vast landmass. Like, what's going on here? At this point, a lot of us have seen variations of this sad graph over the last few years. And a lot of people have, rightfully so, been asking why, as a country, we don't just put more houses on all of that empty land. This would theoretically increase housing supply and in turn lower average housing prices across Canada. Wouldn't it? Well, one of those people is Ontario's Premier Doug Ford, who's suggested that we remove provincial restrictions on land outside of cities across the province so that we can build more houses. A huge issue with that from an environmental perspective is that the land he wants to build on is all protected green space like green belts and farmland, forests, wetlands, or natural habitats. But for this video, we're actually going to ignore the issue of environmental destruction almost entirely. With that pesky life-sustaining environment out of the equation, removing provincial restrictions on land outside of the cities across the province could actually seem like a perfect solution in the short run. But from an economic perspective, will bulldozing paradise really solve the housing crisis? Like at all? Or will it just create new and different problems? Let's dive in to find out. Before we cover anything else, we need to understand the law of supply and demand. If the supply of a good or service outstrips demand, prices will fall. If demands exceed supply, like with homes, prices will rise. Housing is unique because everyone needs a place to live, so as our human population rises, the demand for housing increases with it. Knowing this, you can see that the only way to reduce housing costs in Canada and around the world is to increase the supply of homes. No ifs, ands, or buts. That is how you do it. Now, the federal government has dedicated $2 trillion to get 3.9 million homes built by 2031, but they're missing a vital component to the equation, and this component is the not-so-secret secret that will fix Canada's housing crisis within years instead of never. We'll get to that missing component once we have a bit more clarity on all of the other components to this problem, though, which include the fact that 90% of Canada is uninhabitable. That's because 90% of Canada has land that's not arable, which means that it's not suitable for growing crops or sustaining life. You can visualize these uninhabitable areas with small trees just trying to get by and snag nutrients from wherever and however they can in harsh conditions and where there is permafrost or snow and ice. So for humans, there are no ways of earning a living and sustaining themselves in this 90% of land of Canada that everyone wants to build houses on, seemingly, or even want to live there, isolated and dependent on frickin' airdrops for food and supplies. But then you look at this chart again, and you see just how out of reach home ownership is for the average Canadian nowadays, and think, maybe airdrops aren't such a bad idea, Ben. So what's the proposed solution? Like I said before, Dougie has suggested that we remove the provincial restrictions on land outside of cities across Ontario so that we can build more houses. Elaborating on that, he's suggesting places like the Greater Toronto Area, so the GTA, skip over the Greenbelt and build more outside of it instead of within its boundaries, which are already sprawling insanely. And because we're already talking about money in this video, just so you know, sprawl equals insane property tax hikes for everyone. A bit more on that, densification allows a city's limited infrastructure to serve a lot more people in a concentrated area, thus making your tax dollars go further. A surefire way for your city to increase your property taxes is for it to spread its infrastructure so thinly over huge swaths of land and then make you pay for it. So, if you want to keep your taxes down, you actually want your city to densify. That decreases everyone's taxes by increasing the pool of taxable citizens within your city's bounds, instead of sprawling. Let's move on to some contextual examples of this in action. What Canadian cities have in place to contain sprawl? Toronto and Ottawa are two examples of large Canadian cities that use greenbelts to contain urban sprawl. But what happens when developers leapfrog the greenbelt and start building outside of it? It just causes more traffic because more people now have to drive further to get to their jobs downtown in the core of the city, which then also gets hollowed out by parking, which spreads once tightly packed buildings apart, which then makes more people drive, which makes more people become traffic instead of taking alternative modes of transportation, and the cycle endlessly continues until you figure out a solution. There are solutions, we just haven't implemented them. More on that later. Already in the greater Ottawa area, people drive from Stittsville and Barrhaven and Orleans. In the greater Toronto area, workers often commute in from cities as far away as Peterborough and Barrie and Kitchener-Waterloo just to get to downtown proper for work. Those insanely long drives with ungodly amounts of time spent isolated, focusing intently on driving, hopefully, and sitting in sedentary positions for hours on end are unbearable, yet necessary for many, and cost millions of people their lives, directly and indirectly. Not to mention the huge financial burden of being forced to own and maintain and drive personal vehicles tens of thousands of kilometers per year in order to get to work. I could go on, but this topic is for a future video. Real quick, I have to bring up that to allow for these monstrous commutes to even be possible in the first place, Ottawa and Toronto have highways that cut right through their cities, dividing communities and neighborhoods and destinations themselves, making traffic even worse for everyone. TLDR, urban sprawl causes more traffic and increases costs to you, the taxpayers, since infrastructure is spread out over such great distances that it's just not efficient at all. So, do urban growth boundaries work? Luckily, back in London, which is the 11th largest city in Canada by population, there is still hope. By the way, that's where I live, London, Ontario. While a lot of federal governments around the world are spending billions with a B, as in Ben, to help cities tear down highways and urban freeways that tore through the middle of their bustling cities, London doesn't have expressways or highways running through it. This is actually insanely important as we head into a new era of mobility. And as of right now, we're small enough, geographically, to contain our urban sprawl. For a sprawl boundary, we have an urban growth boundary instead of a green belt, but it accomplishes the same thing. It contains urban sprawl. As long as it's not needlessly expanded. Hint, hint, something's happening in the future. We probably have to do something about that. The official London plan calls for increased density, for building inwards and upwards, and for providing more transportation options instead of just cars. All this densification happens within the urban growth boundary here in London. Although we really need to push that densification harder because London is still known for its insane amount of sprawl. But we need to ask, does densification really work? And if it does, why? Introducing Singapore, where densification brought prosperity. Let's quickly fly around the world to talk about what's going on in Singapore, an island country and city-state with the second highest population density of any country in the world. Yet it has numerous green and recreational spaces resulting from good urban planning. Singapore doesn't have a choice. It can't expand outside of its borders. So it just has to work with the land that it currently has. Even though Singapore occupies a land area less than twice the size of London, its population of 6 million people is 14 times greater in its density and 9 times that of London, Canada. But doesn't all of that make a denser Singapore congested and unlivable? Nah. In Singapore, the higher density and its focus on getting urban infrastructure right in a limited area has led to it having one of the highest GDPs per capita in the world. Singaporeans enjoy some of the longest life expectancies, the fastest internet connection speeds, the lowest infant mortality rates, and the lowest levels of corruption in the world. Singapore ranks highly in key social indicators too, from education to healthcare to quality of life to personal safety and infrastructure and housing, and they have a home ownership rate of 88%. That's pretty good. It's all about how Singapore uses its resources and the land that it already has without the need to sprawl beyond its very restrictive borders. So, When cities like Singapore do it right within their boundaries, they decrease greenhouse gas emissions and have a more active population and have better air quality and have less traffic congestion. Who doesn't want less traffic? And before anyone brings this up, yes, I realize that the city-state status that Singapore has does streamline bureaucratic decision-making and pooling of resources, but we're focusing on how they're able to work within their boundaries. Anyway, Toronto's sprawl has gone wild. In contrast to dense Singapore, let's look at Toronto again, the largest city in Canada and the fourth largest city in all of North America. But the sprawl in the GTA is legendary because of the frenzy of post-World War II building, where the city hungrily gobbled up forests and buried productive farmlands in order to grow. Kind of ironic if you think about it, actually. When I say Toronto, by the way, it's sort of interchangeable with the Greater Toronto Area. They're kind of all meshed together. I know, they're different. Just hear me out here. Of course, with that sprawl comes heavy infrastructure costs to maintain far-flung suburbs. And even with massive investments in lanes upon lanes of highway widenings, Toronto commute times are among the worst in the world, and will always be until viable alternative modes of transportation are introduced.
I've been in that traffic, all right? I've made movies in Toronto, and I've visited Toronto. I have friends in Toronto. What's up with the traffic in Toronto? Have they figured this out?
We have to ask, how can urban sprawl be better than dense, walkable neighborhoods with good public transport? The simple answer? It can't. See, here's the thing. Even among Toronto's sprawling suburbs, there's a growing realization that maybe explosive growth with bland subdivisions and identical-looking cookie-cutter houses wasn't such a good idea after all. Multiple polls show that people in Toronto overwhelmingly desire to live in Toronto's downtown area where amenities and mass transit are accessible by walking and commute times are short. But the reality is that these same people cannot afford to live there. Even the recently elected mayor of Toronto, Olivia Chow, has indicated that urban sprawl is unsustainable.
We have infrastructure gap of $26 billion to maintain the current service level over 10 years.
She says that the $26 billion, again, B as in Ben, again, over the next 10 years needed to stop the decline of Toronto's infrastructure is so staggering that the city needs to pause building anything new. What? That's just to maintain what they currently have. In her words, we need to fix what we have first. Because they can't build, they don't have money to build more. They cannot sustain this. And people complaining about taxes and government spending need to get a clue. This needs to happen. Now back to London, which over the last 5 years has been the fastest growing city in all of Ontario and the fourth fastest growing city in all of Canada. Situated in some of the most productive farmland in the country, London is restrained by an urban growth boundary. For now. There is a pretty big problem though. The City of London has already outgrown its blueprint for growth, dubbed the London Plan, and the City Council is now considering expanding the urban growth boundary. That's not good. To be blunt, that's insanity. And laughable. We need to upgrade our current infrastructure to be able to support more density, not stretch already straining infrastructure to run even further by adding to the sprawl and lowering our already low density. The London Plan calls for continued densification within the urban growth boundary, so London needs to stick to that plan and build inwards and upwards, not outwards. On the positive side, even though London is associated with suburban sprawl because there is a ton of suburban sprawl everywhere, construction cranes have been dotting the skyline for years now, and tall buildings full of people and businesses are steadily replacing non-productive surface parking lots in the downtown area. New infrastructure, such as a bus rapid transit system and more bike lanes, have given Londoners more transportation options. Along with that, radiating outwards from the city center like spokes on a wheel, a bike wheel, nodes of denser housing are being built, clustered around transit villages. In the suburbs, infill housing is replacing single-family homes. And changes in local zoning bylaws now allowed for additional residential units to be built on a single residential property. It's all connected. Like the body's circulatory system, transportation connects people and businesses, places, destinations, things like that. Just densification makes it economically viable to support better infrastructure. With proper implementation, London and other struggling cities around the world will be able to prosper. And that right there is the answer to the question that I brought up at the beginning of the video, by the way. Changing the way we think about homes. We know that the federal government is dedicating $2 trillion to get 3.9 million homes built by 2031. But we have to stop thinking of homes as only houses. We need more homes, yes, but those homes don't need to be the stereotypical America dream homes with a white picket fence. They need to be denser, more community-centered, walkable, bikeable, and transit-oriented than ever before. Also, while you're at it, make sure that awesome soundproofing is required between and around units, because I feel like there should be a law about that. Nobody wants to hear their neighbors through the walls. Anyway, allowing more modern zoning that isn't car-centric is the not-so-secret secret that will fix Canada's housing crisis within years instead of never. Fix the bylaws. Allow for builds other than just single-family dwellings. It needs to happen. So, no. Bulldozing paradise will not solve the housing crisis. Consider the First Nations Cree proverb, as it's more relevant now than ever before. Only when the last tree has been cut down, the last fish been caught, and the last stream poisoned, will we realize we cannot eat money. To cities everywhere, we say respect the green belts and urban growth boundaries. See, these restrictions are strengths, not weaknesses, of geography. Use the space you have before you gobble up prime agricultural and natural areas outside of your city's boundaries that we can never get back once they're paved over. To developers everywhere, we ask, what good will it do to build housing beyond the green belt or urban growth boundaries? New housing needs to be close to amenities with a variety of transportation options. People want and need denser, walkable neighborhoods instead of sprawling, identical cookie-cutter housing developments. To the City of London, we say basically all of the above. You know that urban sprawl is unsustainable. Don't expand the urban growth boundary. Densification, as outlined in the official London plan, is the way to go. Don't waver, even in the face of opposition. Stick to the plan and we will become that welcoming city that everyone wants to live in. If you have any questions, throw them in the comments below. I'll get back to you. Don't forget to like, subscribe for more and everything. Bye!